and welcome to the Leniverse. I am Leni, and this is the video where I attempt the impossible, to predict the longlist for the Women's Prize for Fiction. And I'm not exaggerating, predicting this longlist actually is impossible, because while we do know which books are eligible for the prize, we don't know which books the publishers have actually nominated for the prize. I also think that this past year has been an exceptionally good one for women's writing, because when I started to look into which books could possibly be on the list, I found enough really interesting looking ones to fill 3 lists easily, and that wasn't even at the end of the publishing year. I also came close to being able to fill the whole list with just Irish authors. And while Irish authors are definitely ascendant, just take a look at last year's Booker, they will have to share. But joke aside, and I'm only half joking, if we look at previous year's long lists, there are a few trends that we can use to help us in the predictions. First, the majority of the books are usually somewhat evenly divided between UK authors and US authors, although some of these might have connection to another country, especially a Commonwealth country. There is usually some historical fiction and maybe some magical realism. There will definitely be something about dysfunctional families. The Women's Prize loves a retelling, although hopefully they have moved on from the Greek mythology retellings. And I say this as somebody who has loved Greek mythology since I was a small child. Just enough already. Move on from there. There will often be a bit of humor, dark if we are lucky, dark and absurd if we are really lucky. The Women's Prize is very happy to longlist somebody who has already been longlisted, and even authors who have previously won. But what they like even more than a repeat author is a debut novel. And finally, and this is something that I hadn't noticed until it was pointed out in a video recently by Shelley Swearingen at Shellyish, but there is always at least one novel that was on last year's book-along list. I thought this was more of an occasional overlap, but looking at previous year's lists, I think Shelley is correct, and it just seems to always happen, although I didn't go all the way back to 1996. And then I started thinking, there are rules for how many books each publisher can nominate. Do I have enough variation in publishers? Is my list even possible? But then I decided, sod it, enough, whatever. If I keep this up, I will still be debating my choices when they read out the long list on Tuesday. So this is my list, and I'll just have to stick with it. So here are my predictions based on a bit of strategizing, a bit of mad guesswork, hope and a prayer to the powers to be. That will be the Women's Prize judges. And we will start with the Debutante's Ball. I have no fewer than 8 debut authors on my dance card, half the list. But there is precedence for this. Last year there were as many as 9 debut books. Firstly, 2 of my 3 Irish picks are debut authors. Yes, I have as many as 3 books by Irish authors on this list. I told you I had an excess of Irish authors. I've really trimmed them back. The first one I've seen on a few prediction lists already, and that book is Falling Animals by Sheila Armstrong. In 2009, a dead man was found on a beach in Sligo in Ireland. And while they found the probable cause of death, and there was no foul play, they never discovered the man's identity. Sheila Armstrong explores this mystery by imagining the various encounters that this man had with people leading up to the time of his death. So each chapter is from a different point of view. I haven't read it, but it's supposed to be atmospheric and disquieting, and I like the sound of that. The other Irish debut is one that I haven't seen people talk about, which could mean that it's no good. But the Women's Prize also has a habit of finding books that nobody's talked about and bringing them out into the light, and then they turn out to be really good. So maybe this is one of those. Or maybe I just jinxed it by talking about it. Oops. Anyway, the book is Breakdown by Cathy Sweeney. Cathy Sweeney is, I think, a well-known writer of short stories in Ireland, but this is her first novel. In Breakdown, a middle-aged, middle-class woman in Dublin wakes up one morning and leaves the house and drives away, leaving behind a husband and 2 teenage children. She goes to the coast, and from there she takes a ferry across to Wales, where she ends up in an isolated cottage. So over the course of 48 hours on this journey, we get flashbacks to the events in her life, various traumatic events and things that have led to her departure. It is described as a story of rage and reckoning, joy and transformation. And I mean, female rage, the cottagecore version? Surely this must be a candidate. My third pick is the only debut from my group of American authors. Promise by Rachel Eliza Griffiths is a coming-of-age story set to the late 1950s. We follow 2 sisters who belong to one of the only 2 black families in a village in Maine. It is the start of the civil rights movement, and as the girls grow up and their bodies begin to change, the attitudes of their white neighbors towards them also begin to change. So the neighbors start to view them as a threat to their way of life. And I have a quote from the blurb here. The sisters have to fight to protect their home, their bodies, and their dreams. End of quote. I think this sounds super interesting, both because of the civil rights era setting and because it sounds like it deals with the perception of female bodies, especially black female bodies, as something inherently dangerous. And I am especially drawn to this book because these 2 girls are resourceful, from a loving family. And while I do love a dysfunctional family story, I like that here the family is fully functional and the threat is from the outside, and that there is enough love and security that they can face that threat. I have another short quote here. Promise celebrates one family story of resistance. It's a book that will break your heart and then rebuild it with courage, hope, and love. So, yes, please. This book sounds like it could be brutal but empowering. More of that. The 4th debut is from New Zealand. I actually have a copy here to hold up. Greta Vin was published in New Zealand in 2021, but it was only published very recently in the UK, so it is eligible for the Women's Prize. Greta and Valdin are siblings in a Maori, Russian, Catalonian family, and it's a story of misadventures and messy drama, queerness and multiracial identity. I've had a little look at the first couple of pages and I'm already amused. Books that are meant to be funny are usually a bit hit and miss for me, often a miss, and I get grumpy when we get a book on an otherwise trauma-filled long list, and that it's clearly meant there just for light comedy relief. But I like the look of this one. I think that this would be a good option if the Women's Prize decide to go for a funny book. And now it's time for the British authors, where 4 out of 6 books that I picked are actually by debut authors. Yes, that means that I have snubbed quite a few big-name, well-established authors. Sorry, I found a lot of good-looking debuts. Remember, Remember by L. McRae has only just been published. It is not, as you might think from the title, a retelling of Guy Fawkes. It is a different kind of gunpowder plot. And it is entirely fictional. It is set in 1770s in what might be a sort of alternative history, but very similar to our actual history. And we follow a woman who has managed to escape from slavery, and she is trying to help her brother do the same. When the courts fail to help, to give them justice, she gets embroiled in an explosive plot to take down the transatlantic slave trade. This doesn't sound like a typical Women's Prize book. They do historical fiction and magical realism, but not really alternate history or speculative fiction. I'm not quite sure, where this book lands. But I think it sounds great, and my list has a hefty dose of wishful thinking, so why not? Next, I have Crysalis by Anna Metcalf. And the cover is making me wonder if the protagonist is going to emerge as a metaphorical butterfly, or if it's some more Kafkaesque metamorphosis kind of thing. It's a novel about selfhood and solitude, about daring to take up space, about controlling your own life. The novel was inspired by The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and it follows a similar style where we only get to know the protagonist through the people around her. I think this is a really interesting device to have a woman who rebels against expectations and reshapes herself, but we only get to know her through the people's reactions and perceptions of her, and she is still largely unknown to us. But whereas the vegetarian not only ate less, but also became more disconnected, almost fading away in body and spirit, the protagonist of Crysalis builds muscle and wants to be more present in the world. The penultimate debut is The House of Broken Bricks by Fiona Williams. In this book, we follow a biracial family who has moved from London to rural Somerset due to some traumatic event, but also because the father of the family his family has links to the area and he loves it there. The mother, on the other hand, is the London-born child to Jamaican parents. Rural Somerset is a very white part of the country, and it's difficult for the mother to fit in. Their children are non-identical twins, and one of them is black presenting and the other is white presenting. Something that it appears to be very difficult for their surroundings to understand. So that in addition to figuring out how they themselves feel about their background and their identity and finding their place, they also have to deal with people claiming that they can't possibly be twins or thinking that their mother must be the nanny. The writing is described as lyrical, poetic, exquisite. It is a book about healing and finding your roots, and not only about your differences, but also about what Jamaicans and the rural British have in common. And then finally, one more debut, and it is the obligatory Booker book. I kind of wanted to use All the Little Bird Hearts, but it looks like that was published in March last year, so it's a little bit too early and it's not eligible. So instead I went with Western Lane by Chatna Maru, because I liked that one well enough too. Western Lane is about coping with grief through obsessively playing squash instead of talking about it. It is also about being a minority girl and being torn between your family's traditional expectations and your life in the majority society. I felt that that part of the book was a little bit underdeveloped, but the grief and the family dynamics were well done, and they even managed to make squash seem interesting. So I think this has a good chance of being on the list. Okay, debutante ball is over. The young folks have gone home, and now it's time for the after party with the usual suspects. These are the repeat authors. They have either been listed before or they are big names that have been nominated for other awards. I have snubbed quite a few of them because I think there are enough repeat authors with eligible books this year to fill the entire list, and what would be the fun in that? I have 4 writers in this category, 1 previous winner, 1 who has been shortlisted twice, and 2 who have not been on the Women's Prize longlist, but have been nominated for different book awards. Let's start with the Irish writer again. I actually have that here. Anne Enright was shortlisted for the Women's Prize both in 2012 and in 2016. And before that, she won the Booker in 2007. The Wren is about a complicated mother-daughter relationship. I love those, and so I think do the Women's Prize. And this relationship plays out against the legacy of the mother's long-dead father, who was a good poet, but a lousy father. This is a book about generational behavior patterns and abuse, but it is also written with some humor. And that's the best kind, I think, when you can take serious themes and treat them properly and with respect, but also with some dark humor. We saw that last year with The Bandit Queens. I don't know if this is as humorous. I've only read 30 pages or so, but I am really looking forward to reading more, and I think this could be a good fit for the longlist. Next, we have Anne Patchett, who actually won the Women's Prize in 2002. I am a bit uncertain about this pick because it is a very quiet book that I think could easily become overlooked. I have read Tom Lake and I loved it. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy to hold up because it was a library book that I have long since returned. Yeah, I'm not sure if it will grab the judges' attention. I think it depends a bit on where you are in your head when you read it. It is highly inspired by the play Our Town by Thornton Wilder, and various productions of the play feature strongly in the book. Now, Our Town is extremely minimalist without any props. The actors are just miming out their actions, pretending to hold objects. Tom Lake is not as minimalist, but it does have limited settings, and it has that feel to it, slightly minimalist feel, because there's not that much happening. It's not a high-stakes book. It is very calm, but it is a deep pond. You can enjoy the book on a surface level, where there's a mother entertaining her 3 grown daughters with the story of when she was acting in Our Town and was dating another actor who later went on to become a huge movie star. Then there's a layer of what she is choosing to tell them and what she is choosing to hold back. All the little reveals, the role of their father in the story. It's a book about life choices and finding your happiness. And then there's the underlaying layer, the backdrop. Our Town is set in a small town in the years leading up to World War I, when everything changed. It's a snapshot of a community on the verge of something irretrievable. Tom Lake is set on a cherry farm during COVID lockdown. It shows a small community just as everything changes, and you have climate change lurking in the near future, and they are worried about whether their cherry trees will survive the changes in climate and in temperature. I read this book in December after a year of reading a lot of books about war and abuse and just trauma. And reading Tom Lake was like a balm for the soul. I enjoyed every page of it. I think there's a decent chance that this book will hit one of the judges in the same way, at the right time, and that it will end up on the long list. And even if it doesn't, you basically got a mini review from me here now, and I just recommend first reading Outtown, or watching it, if that's an option, and then reading Tom Lake. Then we come to Alice McDermot, who is a 3-time Pulitzer finalist. Absolution is set during the Vietnam War when 2 American wives in Saigon start an intense project of do-goodery to relieve suffering and wretchedness. They are well-meaning and determined, but the question remains if they actually do good. 60 years later, the daughter of one of them contacts the other woman, and they start talking about their shared memories of that time. And they have to confront how that campaign of altruism shaped their lives, and also how their memories of events differ. I think this sounds like a very different take on the Vietnam War, and then an interesting one that would suit the Women's Prize. And then my final big name author is Jasmine Ward, who has won the National Book Award in America twice, but has never been listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction, which seems like a strange oversight. And this also brings us to the magical realism part of my list. Let Us Descend is set in the American South during the slavery era, and we follow a girl who has been sold by the white man who also fathered her, and that just boggles the mind how anybody could do that. I think most of the book is set during the journey to the place that she's been sold to. And the magical realism part, I think, is about the myths that her African grandmother has told her and how the girl manages to somehow connect or communicate with the spirits of the land. I don't really know much more. I've had this book on hold at the library for months, and now I am the second in line, so hopefully I'll get to it soon. And maybe it will be on the long list. That would be great, because then I'll actually have time to read it before I have to return it because somebody else wants to read it. Okay, that's 12 books, 4 to go. And 3 of them I have loosely categorized as variations on a theme. Strictly speaking, Tom Lake belongs in this category as well because of its connection with our town, and maybe also Crysalis because of that whole vegetarian metamorphosis thing it has going on. But now it's time for one of the books that everybody's been predicting. Yes, you guessed it. It's Julia by Sandra Newman. And I'm sure everybody knows by now that this is a retelling of George Orwell's 1984, but from Julia's perspective. So the female love interest gets to tell her side of the story. I haven't read this yet. I read We by Yevgeny Zamayatin last month, and that was the book that inspired George Orwell to write 1984. And I am now rereading 1984, and then I'll get to Julia. This is kind of a big Orwell year. It's the 75th anniversary of the first publication of 1984, and there are a lot of Orwell-inspired books dealing with Orwell coming out this year. and the Women's Prize for Nonfiction put Wifedom on their long list, which is a book about Orwell's wife. And I think it seems fairly likely that Julia will be on the fiction long list. My second book in this group is not a retelling as such, but it incorporates a Shakespeare play. Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad follows a Palestinian woman who has lived in England for many, many years, working as an actress, and she hasn't been back to Palestine since her childhood, the Intifada. But after a breakup or her marriage falling apart, she decides to go back to Haifa, which is a city in Israel, to visit her sister. And while she grapples with her identity after having been away for so many years, she gets involved with an Arabic production of Hamlet in the occupied West Bank, hence the title and the ghost. I hope this book makes the long list because it sounds really good and because I am a sucker for anything involving Hamlet and because I think it is important for Palestinian voices to be heard, especially now, and because there is more to Palestine than Gaza. Book 15, and now it is finally time for a book from Nigeria. Nigerian fiction has been on the rise for years, and I would be really surprised if one wasn't included on this year's long list. I have chosen The Middle Daughter by Chika Unigwe. This is a modern adaptation of the myth of Hades and Persephone. Yes, I said I didn't want any more Greek retellings, but hear me out. What I dislike about the Greek mythology retellings is that it is basically the same story that we've already read, but centered around a female character, a female point of view, and then it makes very obvious what we already know, which is that all the gods and the heroes of Greek mythology are self-entitled douchebags. This is not news. We know it. It's all there in the original myth. The Middle Daughter, on the other hand, takes this myth and transplants it to modern-day Nigeria. And this uses the universality of the myth, the core, the thing that makes those myths still interesting to us, that tells us something about humanity, the human situation, relationships. So in this book, we have a 17-year-old girl who is grieving the loss of both her sister and her father. This makes her an easy target for a good-looking preacher who offers her a new place to belong, but also isolates her from her family. I am all for using Greek myths as a launch pad and frame of reference, and I am very interested to read this particular reimagining. And that brings us to the final book. And this one is a bit of a gamble and a long shot. I'm not entirely sure that it's eligible. It might be too short. And it has practically no plot. Books have to be over 30,000 words long. And by my estimates, this is around there, just. If it is long enough, what it has going for it is that it is different without being totally experimental, and it is beautifully written. I am, of course, talking about Orbital by Samantha Harvey. So in this book, we follow 4 astronauts and 2 cosmonauts for 24 hours on the International Space Station. They orbit the planet multiple times in this time frame, and each chapter is a new orbit. It's not the most exciting read. Don't read it while you're tired. It will not help keep you awake. But it is a surprising book. Maybe not if you are very interested in the lives of astronauts and you have looked into what's going on, but it has never occurred to me to think about what the astronauts are actually doing up on the International Space Station, what their workday looks like, what kind of experiments they're running, why are they there. I didn't even realize that it's possible to talk to the astronauts if you have the right kind of radio and know what frequency to tune into, and when they are passing by in orbit, you can actually have a conversation with them for a few minutes. There are great descriptions of their activities. I experienced a sense of total vertigo while reading about a spacewalk. But the book is also full of a certain wistfulness and the push and pull of really missing Earth and feeling alone and not exactly lost in space, but at least isolated from the planet. But at the same time, having that companionship with your fellow astronauts and the feeling that you never want to return to Earth because being in space is the best thing ever and the ultimate ambition. I really wonder if Harvey interviewed astronauts for this book, or if she just imagined the kind of thoughts and musings and conversations that they might be having up there. I'd love to read a review of this book by an astronaut who could either confirm that, yeah, that's pretty much it, we do think of crazy stuff like that, or if it's just, nah, we don't worry about that, we just get on with things. Maybe Harvey could be the ghostwriter for an astronaut, so that we could get the real inside scoop, but with Harvey's beautiful prose. Okay, that's it. That's my 16 predictions or wild guesses or wishful thinkings. Hopefully I'll get at least one or two of them right, so I don't have to hang my head in shame for having gotten it all wrong. But obviously I don't want to get too many of them right either, because one of the best things about book awards is that they bring out the books that you have never heard of, would never have noticed or read otherwise, and then they turn out to be really great. If you sat through all of that, thank you for watching, and I'll be back next week with a lot of enthusiasm, hopefully, and a reading plan for the long list.